Good evening. You have found Impossible VHS. If you are not sure how you got here, that is probably fine. Most things worth finding do not have clear directions. Every Sunday night, we open the archive. The archive contains stories from places that do not exist anymore, from timelines that went sideways, from worlds that were built quickly and on a budget, and with the best intentions, more or less. Tonight is episode 0, the Prologue, which means you are at the very beginning of something. That does not happen very often. Most things you find are already halfway through themselves by the time you arrive. Take your time with this one. The story rewards it. This is Impossible VHS. I am glad you are here. Impossible VHS. Unnamed. Impossible VHS. Book 1. Warehouse Blue. Prologue. Before the Arrow. Globestar appeared on the edge of Carthage on a Tuesday in March. Not built. Appeared. One day there was a vacant lot with a chain-link fence and a sign that said, "Coming soon," in the specific font of things that are never coming soon, and then there wasn't. There was a gas station. The signage was slightly wrong in a way nobody could specify. The pumps were a brand that didn't appear in any directory. The coffee was, inexplicably, very good. Carthage absorbed it the way small towns absorb inexplicable things, which is to say completely and without comment. A new thing was a new thing. People needed gas. Globestar had started in Houston, Texas, which made a certain kind of sense. Houston understood oil and infrastructure, and the specific logic of a place that exists to move things from one location to another without asking too many questions about the things. The chain had done well. Then a Singapore conglomerate had acquired it, which also made a certain kind of sense, because Singapore understood efficiency and interfaces, and the specific logic of a place that exists between very different things and makes them work together. The chain had done better. What had happened after the Singapore acquisition was not something that appeared in any filing Mike would ever have access to. The coffee, though. The coffee was very good. Mike Briggs applied for a job because he needed money, and it was close, and the help wanted sign had been in the window since before the building existed, which he filed under, probably fine. He was the first employee. The interview was conducted via video call with the assistant manager, who appeared on screen in a room that was either very small or very large, depending on which moment you looked at it. The connection was bad in a specific way. Not pixelated, not frozen, just slightly wrong, like the signal was traveling further than video calls were supposed to travel. The assistant manager asked competent questions. Mike answered them. The assistant manager said they'd be in touch, and the call ended, and Mike got the job. The company was based in Singapore. This explained the connection. He would continue assuming this for longer than was reasonable. He did not question why the assistant manager never came in. Corporate sent employees. The first one arrived on a Monday. By Wednesday, he had developed an ongoing and escalating problem with direct sunlight that was difficult to categorize on any form Mike could find in the HR portal. By Friday, he was gone. Mike called him Sonny, privately, which felt like the right name for something that had not worked out well with the sun. Transfer. The second employee was fine in every measurable way except for the smell, which was not a bad smell exactly. More like a very specific smell that caused Mike to briefly and repeatedly believe he was somewhere else. A field, a corridor, a room he had never been in that felt like somewhere he used to live. It happened every 40 minutes with the regularity of something on a timer. The overnight shift became difficult to complete with full continuity of self. Mike called him Mr. Lavender. Transfer. The third one communicated in a frequency that caused the hot dog roller to malfunction in a new and creative way each shift. Mike filed 11 maintenance requests in 9 days. He called this one Hot Dog Guy because that was what he had caused, and that was enough. Transfer. The fourth one purchased everything in the store at the start of each shift and returned everything at the end. Every item. Every shift. Mike asked about this once and received a 45-minute explanation that was delivered with complete sincerity and that left him knowing significantly less about commerce than he had before the conversation started. Mike called this one the auditor. Transfer. The fifth employee was technically perfect. Every task completed correctly and on time. Every customer interaction handled with flawless efficiency. Every protocol followed to the letter. Mike found this the most unsettling of all and could not explain why. It was like watching someone do a very good impression of a convenience store employee. Everything right, nothing present. That one transferred itself, submitted the paperwork, and was gone before Mike came in for his shift. He found the forms on the counter, filled out correctly, signed in a hand that looked like handwriting, the way the fifth employee had looked like a person. Mike never came up with a nickname for that one. Some things don't get names. He made coffee. Waited. Glenn arrived on a Tuesday. He had the correct paperwork. He operated the register without being shown how. He asked Mike one question about the coffee machine. Which button is the one that doesn't work? And when Mike pointed to it, Glenn nodded and never touched it and never asked another question about anything. After 5 employees, Mike found this so restful, he almost sat down. Glenn did not melt. Glenn did not smell like elsewhere. Glenn did not purchase and return the entire store inventory. Glenn did not cause equipment to malfunction or perform a flawless impression of a human being. Glenn was, by every available metric, the most normal person who had ever worked at Globestar. Mike would later understand that this should have been the first warning sign. At the time, he just made Glenn a coffee and showed him where the mop was, and went home and slept better than he had in 2 weeks. Globestar was open 24 hours. Mike's shift ended at midnight. He walked out of the store on Glenn's 3rd day of employment into the specific quality of a Carthage night that was very dark and very quiet and smelled like cut grass and someone else's exhaust. And Glenn was standing outside the entrance on the narrow strip of concrete between the door and the parking lot. Just standing there. Mike looked at him. Glenn looked back with the patient expression of someone who had been doing what they were doing for a while and did not find it remarkable. "Your shift ended," Mike said. "Yes," Glenn said, "hours ago." 7 hours, Glenn said, approximately. Mike looked at him standing there on the concrete in the dark. Then he looked back at the store, lit up and running, and not needing either of them, and did the math quietly. Glenn's shift ended at 5 p.m. Glenn had been standing here since 5 p.m. Mike thought about all the days he had come in and relieved Glenn, and Glenn had left, and Mike had assumed Glenn had gone somewhere, home, wherever, the somewhere that people go when they leave a place. Glenn had not gone somewhere. Glenn had been standing outside the store, possibly every day, waiting for Mike to come back. Not because he needed Mike specifically, just because the store was the reference point, and outside the store was the edge of the known map, and Glenn had been standing at the edge of the known map for 7 hours without complaint, because that was what you did when you didn't know what else to do. "You don't have anywhere to go," Mike said. It wasn't a question.
"I have been," Glenn said carefully, deciding.
"For 7 hours.
"The decision," Glenn said, "is taking longer than expected."
Mike looked at him for a moment. At the parking lot, at the Carthage night, doing its thing. "You can take my couch," he said. Glenn looked at him with the specific attention of someone receiving information that requires careful processing.
"That is," Glenn said, "a yes from me."
Mike drove them home. Glenn took the couch. 7 months later, he was still there. The roommate situation became the arrangement, the way arrangements become arrangements, when nobody objects and the alternative is a conversation neither party particularly wants to have. Glenn was a good roommate, in the specific ways that mattered. He was quiet. He cleaned things. He bought groceries with a thoroughness that suggested he had researched the concept of groceries and was executing it correctly, if slightly formally. The refrigerator was always stocked. The items were always labeled. There was always more coffee than Mike could drink, and Glenn didn't drink coffee at all. Glenn made tea in the mornings. Mike made coffee. Glenn filed things, receipts, notices, the small bureaucratic debris of daily life, with a thoroughness that Mike found either admirable or alarming, depending on his mood. Mike did not file things. Mike had a drawer. The drawer did not judge him. Glenn asked questions about human behavior with the focused sincerity of someone taking notes for a test they intended to pass. Why do people apologize for things they didn't do? Why does the weather require commentary? Why do humans say they're fine when the physical indicators suggest otherwise? Mike answered honestly, because lying to Glenn felt like kicking something that didn't understand why it was being kicked. When Mike asked where Glenn was from, Glenn said,
"Singapore,"
without hesitating, because that was true, and also because the rest of the answer was not something he was supposed to provide. Mike said, "Oh, that makes sense," and went back to his coffee. It did make sense. Glenn's slightly formal precision, the thoroughness, the efficiency, the sense of someone operating in a place that wasn't quite their reference point, but was close enough to navigate. Mike had met people from Singapore exactly once in his life, but he had a general impression, and Glenn fit it well enough that the question closed and didn't reopen. Glenn noted this in his file under Singapore cover story, holding. Glenn watched Mike come home from shifts and not look at the sky. Glenn did not mention this. It was not his information to offer. The thing about Glenn and Yes was that it wasn't a decision. It was a substrate. Glenn had been built, trained, shaped, processed, whatever the word was for what the contractor system did to the beings it sent out into the universe. In an environment where yes was the correct response to almost everything. Yes to the posting, yes to the assignment, yes to the revised brief, yes to the compressed timeline. The contractor system rewarded. Yes, the way gravity rewards falling. It wasn't a choice. It was just what happened when a thing went the direction it was pointed. Mike noticed this about 3 weeks into the roommate arrangement. Corporate sent a policy update requiring all Globestar locations to implement a new customer greeting protocol. The greeting was 7 words long and appeared to be a mistranslation of something that had made sense in a different context. It was not a good greeting. It was the greeting equivalent of the coffee machine button that didn't work. Glenn read the policy update, said yes before Mike finished reading it, was executing the greeting with complete sincerity by the following morning. Mike watched a customer receive the greeting and then stand very still for a moment with the expression of someone trying to locate which part of what just happened was the part they were supposed to respond to. "You know you don't have to do that," Mike said, after the customer left. Glenn looked at him with genuine attention. This was how Glenn looked at things he was genuinely trying to understand. Full attention, no performance, the specific focus of someone for whom understanding was the actual goal rather than the appearance of it.
"It's in the policy," Glenn said.
"Yeah, but it's a bad policy."
"It's still in the policy."
"Right, but..." Mike stopped. Started again. "Glenn, you could say no." "To the policy?"
"To the policy."
Glenn thought about this with the seriousness he brought to things that required seriousness.
"No is," Glenn said slowly. "No is a word I know."
"Okay.
I know the word.
I know you know the word."
I use the word.
Mike thought about the 7 months of living with Glenn. The grocery lists, the filed receipts, the answered questions, the coffee always ready. He tried to remember a single instance of Glenn declining anything. "When?" Mike said. "When have you used it?" Glenn thought about this for longer than the question should have required.
"It's a word I know," he said finally. "I know it."
"Sure," Mike said. He let it go. Filed it under Glenn things. Moved on. But the shape of it stayed with him. The memo arrived on a Thursday. It was formatted the way corporate formatted things, which was efficiently and without warmth, and with the specific confidence of a document that had been generated by a system that had no mechanism for receiving a response other than acknowledged and understood. Globestar Corporate had reviewed the staffing data. Glenn's biological profile indicated a sleep requirement of approximately 3 hours per 24-hour cycle. This represented a significant operational efficiency opportunity. Effective immediately, Glenn would cover the primary shift. Mike would cover the supplementary hours. The supplementary hours were 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. Mike's student loan benefit was reclassified under a line item that no longer existed in the new compensation structure. This was presented as a structural clarification rather than a change. Glenn read the memo. Said yes, not out loud, not even consciously. Glenn said yes to the memo the way a door says yes to being opened. It was just what happened, the path of least resistance, the direction of the thing when the force was applied. Mike read the memo. Read it again. Looked at Glenn. Glenn was already moving on to the next item in his inbox. The yes so complete and immediate it had left no mark on him at all. Like water saying yes to the shape of a container it had already filled. "Glenn," Mike said.
"Yes," Glenn said, and then appeared to register the specific weight of the moment and looked up.
"You just said yes to this."
"It came from corporate."
"It came from corporate, and it cuts my loan benefit, and puts me on the worst 4 hours of the day. Glenn looked at the memo. At Mike. At the memo. Processing.
The operational efficiency.
I don't care about the operational efficiency, Glenn.
The staffing data indicates.
Glenn. Mike put his hand flat on the counter. You could have said no before they sent this when they called you about my hours. You could have said no. Glenn was quiet for a moment. In the way he was quiet when something was genuinely not computing. Not the performance of processing, but the actual experience of a framework, encountering something it didn't have a category for.
They asked, Glenn said finally, if I would be available for the extended hours. They asked, and I.
He stopped. You said yes, Mike said.
I said yes, Glenn confirmed.
And then they cut my benefits.
Those are, Glenn said slowly, connected.
They're connected, Glenn. Another silence. Longer this time. Glenn looked at the memo with the expression of someone reading a document they had already read and finding, on the second reading, that it said something different than they understood the first time.
I think, Glenn said, I need to think about this.
Yeah, Mike said. Think about it. He put on his jacket, picked up his keys. At the door he stopped, turned back. Glenn was still looking at the memo. No is a real word, Mike said. You can use it. It works. He left. Glenn stood behind the counter for a long time after that. He did not say yes to anything for the next 40 minutes, which was unprecedented, and which he achieved by simply not speaking. It was harder than it sounded. His phone buzzed 20 minutes later. It was Mike. Hey, just so you know, I'm not working those shifts. Since you're acting assistant manager, or whatever you can consider this, my resignation. No offense to you personally. Glenn read it. Read it again. He thought about what to say to that. He thought about 8 months of the same store, and the same overnight, and the couch, and the drawer, and the fast clock, and Mike coming home from shifts and not looking at the sky. He thought about the memo, and the hours, and yes, and the door closing. He thought about what no offense to you personally meant when it came from someone who meant it and also meant the opposite of it simultaneously.
He typed, I understand. I'll file the paperwork.
He looked at that for a moment. Deleted it.
Typed, okay.
Sent it. Glenn's contractor device buzzed while he was still holding Mike's phone. He looked at it. Welcome to your provisional assistant manager role at Globestar Carthage. Your credentials have been updated. Please review the attached operational documentation at your earliest convenience. Glenn stood behind the counter, holding both notifications at the same time. Mike's resignation. Corporate's welcome. He had been waiting for the corporate notification for 11 months. He had filed the initial paperwork in his second week. He had followed up 3 times. He had received 2 form letters. He had stopped following up because the contractor system had trained him to understand that certain processes moved on their own timeline, and the most useful response was to do the job correctly and wait. He had done the job correctly. He had waited. And the notification had arrived in the same minute as Mike's resignation, which was either terrible timing or the most accurate summary of how institutional systems worked that Glenn had ever encountered. Glenn had sent Mike away. Corporate had sent Glenn a welcome email. Both things were true at the same time. He opened the attached documentation and read it carefully, the way he read everything, which was completely and in order, and with attention to the footnotes. It was 37 pages. He read all 37 pages. On page 14 was the continuity protocol section. On page 14 was the Mike hologram. On page 14 was the Glenn hologram button he was not going to press for a long time. Glenn looked at that entry for a moment. The Mike hologram made sense. The Mike hologram was covered under the contract. The Mike hologram was another person's likeness deployed for operational continuity, and Glenn had no philosophical difficulty with it. The Glenn hologram was a representation of Glenn himself, standing behind a counter being Glenn, while Glenn was somewhere else not being Glenn. And something about this produced in Glenn a sensation he did not immediately have a word for. He consulted his notes on human emotional states. The closest match appeared to be anxiety. Glenn considered this. He had read about anxiety. He understood it as a response to uncertain outcomes, a forward projection of potential negative scenarios that the cognitive system rehearsed in lieu of actual preparation. He had categorized it as a human phenomenon, relevant to his field observations, but not personally applicable, in the same way that sunburn was relevant to his field observations, but not personally applicable. He looked at the Glenn hologram button. He looked at it for quite a long time.
I suppose, he said to himself quietly in the empty store at midnight, that I will not be pressing that button.
He noted in his file, Glenn hologram, available, not deploying. Possible anxiety, further study needed. Do humans have anxiety about their own holograms? Probably not a common question. Filing under, unique to current circumstances. On page 14, in a subsection labeled Likeness and Operational Continuity Rights, was a reference to a clause in a standard contractor agreement, the kind of agreement that got signed on a tablet at a counter at midnight because the job paid triple and it was rent. Glenn read this subsection twice. He thought about Mike checking the boxes without reading them. He thought about the fact that he had known Mike was going to do that, had known it the moment he slid the tablet across the counter, had constructed the moment specifically for a person who was going to check the boxes without reading them, because that was what Mike did. And Glenn knew Mike and Glenn had been waiting for the right moment for 8 months. He suspected that ready was not a state you arrived at. He suspected it was a state you performed until it became true. Welcome to your provisional assistant manager role. Glenn put both devices in his pocket, made sure the coffee was fresh. Darnell would be through in 20 minutes. Mike was still on the couch when Glenn got home that morning. Neither of them mentioned the resignation or the welcome email. Glenn made tea. Mike made coffee. The clock on the kitchen wall ran 11 seconds fast. Glenn timed it, did not fix it. Some things stayed the way they were until they didn't. The months passed, the way months pass when you are waiting for something. Not quickly, not slowly, but with the specific quality of time that is being spent rather than lived. Mike delivered food. Glenn worked the overnight. The apartment held them both in the loose arrangement that had become their normal, which was not what either of them had planned, and which neither of them was going to be the one to change. Glenn watched Mike come home from shifts and not look at the sky. He had been watching this for a long time. He had the contractor device. He had the provisional assistant manager clearance. He had, on page 14, of the documentation he had read completely and in order, access to the job feed visibility controls. The parameters that determined which listings appeared to which contractors, at which rates, at which times. He was not supposed to use these for personal reasons. He had been thinking about whether this was a personal reason for approximately 6 weeks. The argument against he would be using his clearance to influence a specific person's job feed for reasons that had nothing to do with Globestar's operational requirements. That was personal. That was, depending on the interpretation, interference. The argument for Mike was a credentialed contractor, in good standing, whose ping thought device had received the onboarding documentation Glenn had processed at the Globestar counter 8 months ago. The job was legitimate. The pay rate was standard enhanced. The only thing Glenn would be adjusting was visibility. Mike would still choose freely. Mike would still take it or not take it based on his own assessment. Glenn would just be making sure it appeared at the right moment. The right moment was the question. Glenn had been thinking about the right moment since the night Mike walked out. He had been turning it in his head the way you turn something when you are trying to find the angle at which it becomes what you need it to be. He knew Mike. He knew the way Mike made decisions. Quickly, under pressure, at midnight, when the job paid triple, and the alternative was going home to an apartment where the clock ran 11 seconds fast, and the plant was dead, and the couch belonged to an alien who had said yes to a memo without finishing the sentence. He knew what the right moment looked like. He knew what Mike needed to see it. He did not know if what he was doing was right. He was fairly certain it was the most useful thing he had ever done. He opened the visibility controls on his contractor device at 11:23 p.m. on a Tuesday. He found the job. Standard enhanced pay, non-standard zone pickup, no description. The kind of listing that sat in the feed going stale because most contractors didn't want non-standard zone work, and the ones who did had full queues. He adjusted the visibility parameters. The job would now appear at the top of Mike's feed. At triple rate, at the moment Mike opened Ping Thought in the Wendy's parking lot. Glenn looked at what he had done. Filed it under. Not interference, technically. Review pending. Probably fine. Possibly not fine. Doing it anyway. He closed the device. Made sure the coffee was fresh. Went back to his laminated sheet. Then one night, Mike took a job that paid triple with no description, and the blue arrow on his phone pointed northeast, past the water tower, toward the edge of town. And Glenn looked up from his laminated sheet and felt something he did not have a precise word for in any of the 4 languages he spoke. Something like, there it is. Something like, finally. Something like,
I'm sorry it took this long.
Glenn had been waiting for the right moment. He had not known, until this moment, that waiting for the right moment was also a kind of yes. That was something to think about. He thought about it while Mike walked through the door.
That was the prologue of Impossible VHS, Before the Arrow. We will be back next Sunday with Chapter 1. Unless you are listening to this in the future, then all bets are off. Mike Briggs, $39, a blue arrow pointing up. If this found you at the right moment, if something in it landed where you needed it to, tell someone. Not for the algorithm, just because a story that travels further has a better chance of mattering to someone who needed it. The archive is open every Sunday night. We will see you then.